If you're a fan of retro design, mid-century design, or even comic book design, you are going to love this video because we are breaking down what we're calling atomic age design. It's quirky, playful, and captures a specific look from when people thought, I guess we'd be living in space by now, and apparently they thought of using risograph techniques and halftones and things like that as the best way to capture this, so it's really fun. I'm going to share 5 of the main defining characteristics of atomic age design, and one trait in particular is pretty bizarre and something I'd actually recommend you not do in your work. So we'll get into that a little bit later. And just a quick side note, you may have heard this style called atomic mid-century design or space age design, and you can search a lot of these phrases in Pinterest actually and then combine it with design or poster design, and you're gonna get some really awesome references like the ones we're gonna show in this video. But let's start with a little bit of backstory. Atomic age design spans roughly from the 1940s through the 60s, and debatably starting back in the 30s. And this is also the same time period that the broader category of mid-century design is taking off. So keep that in mind, and we've also done a video about mid-century design here on the channel if you want to check that out. So at this time, technology was exploding and people were looking toward the future. The space race was heating up, and this meant that people were obsessed with things like rockets and satellites and just everything else space themed. Now, at the same time, there was tension in the air, but also this feeling of optimism, and particularly for designers and advertisers and brand, the optimism was great because they could capitalize on this style of design. So designers wanted to capture this sentiment in a new style and pull the world into this new age, and mid-century modern was born, which gives us those clean lines and all of the orderly structures, but then atomic age stemmed off of that as a more playful subset, so it's more childlike, a little bit more comic book-esque, and people loved it. I mean, advertisers really capitalized on this style and it spread pretty wide. All right, with some background out of the way, let's dive into one of my favorite traits of atomic design. And so for the first trait, we're talking about fonts. I'm gonna scroll through this collection of atomic age designs here on Pinterest, and you should be able to notice that the typography in this style is pretty easily recognizable. They have that classic 50s look. In other words, it looks like it belongs. Typically, these fonts were bold and thick with quirky details like angled serifs or maybe exaggerated curves. But another font style that was very common, and you'll probably recognize it, was this flowing kind of hand-drawn monoline script. And what makes it really recognizable is the exaggerated loops or the thick and thin stroke. And it's more cartoonish, but in an elegant sort of way. You will often see these two font styles mixed together within one composition. And so overall, these fonts were designed to really grab your attention from maybe a roadside sign or a magazine ad. And we actually have a list of fonts from the 1950s plus other decades in our guide to retro fonts that I'm going to link down in the description. You're definitely going to want to check that out if you are interested, because you can just open up the list that I'm talking about and immediately get access to the fonts in the Kittl editor. You're going to find some of our classics in there like Adventure, or you might find Mid-Phi-Lite, as well as some other more funky options like Font Diner, Swanky, and Bigelow Rules. And all you need to access these, by the way, is a Kittl account that is free. You can just use the link down in the description to get set up. All right, next up, let's talk about arguably the most important part of atomic age design, imagery. So we're talking illustrations, icons, symbols. Atomic design is covered in them, and you've got things like satellites orbiting planets, rockets blasting off, little atomic models with their orbiting electrons, and starbursts everywhere. The starbursts and the electrons is probably the most iconic symbols for this era, and it was used for actual product design like light fixtures and clocks and other things like that. But prints were also a major deal here, so you're going to think about wallpaper, fabric patterns, and of course graphic design. So you'd see this in magazines, posters, advertisements, and so on. The boomerang shape was another particularly cool one, and by the way, you can find shapes like what I'm talking about in Kittl over in the graphics library. You can just type mid-century and you're going to see everything that you see on the screen here. Now keep in mind, the imagery wasn't really trying to be realistic. It was more symbolic, again, more cartoon-like. Illustration styles were leaning into that simple, flat, but highly stylized look. People or characters were also frequently used in the imagery to add a happy personality to it, but they stayed in that overall cartoon comic-like style with the exaggerated hair, bold outlines, but minimal shadow detail. We can see renditions of this done in more modern time, trying to replicate this style. For example, if you're a fan of Fallout, we have that little blonde-haired boy, which is a playful, cartoonish little character that was the face for spreading some pretty serious information. And Marvel has played with this theme as well in their Disney Plus series called Loki, which I absolutely love. And Miss Minutes was a literal little cartoon clock, and she perfectly matches that 50s style optimism while still kind of hiding some more heavier topics. So if you haven't seen Loki, I won't spoil it for you, but you should go check it out. And let me know in the comments if you know what I'm talking about or if you've seen either of these before, because I'm curious to know if you have already been picking up on the Atomic Age themes. All right, the imagery for the Atomic Age was all about taking something more destructive and reframing it as playful and hopeful and futuristic. The contrast is part of what makes the style distinct from mid-century modern as a whole, because it's a style that was kind of turned from fear into fun. Now, real quick, if you've got value from this video so far, I'd really appreciate if you hit that like button and the subscribe button. It helps us out a ton and allows us to produce more content just like this. Okay, let's talk about color palette. I mentioned briefly when we talked about fonts that Atomic Age design has and had a distinct style, and the color is no exception. It leaned heavily into saturated, happy colors. Think turquoise, bright red, golden yellow, avocado green, and vibrant orange. You should be able to see this very clearly as we scroll through some of these designs. You'd also see some pastel pinks or mint greens and black and white, or maybe off black and off white, and these were used as accents or maybe for the text. And now this brings us to our fourth point, which is texture, another big part of Atomic design, as well as blending with the colors. So since a lot of this was print, you would see halftone dots, grainy overlays, and ink bleeds, and these weren't necessarily intentional effects because they came from the limitations and or quirkiness of the printing technology, but now they're an iconic part of the style that designers are trying to replicate. So you're gonna notice vintage Atomic posters often have a slightly rough feel to them. The backgrounds aren't really flat, they're crinkled or faded or they're splattered, and modern recreations like these templates I found in Kittl will intentionally add those textures back into them to make them feel more rugged and authentic. So if you're recreating the style, some textures that you could use that I would recommend are things like rough paper, photocopy, and halftone textures and dots. You can find all of these in Kittl, by the way, in the graphics library directly in the editor when you are working on a project. All right, now we've gotten to our final and our weirdest trait that I mentioned earlier, and this is not really used anymore for very obvious reasons, but some Atomic Age posters and products actually experimented with glow-in-the-dark inks and phosphorescent finishes. Now, the reason this trend didn't stick is obviously for safety and practicality. The phosphorescent inks of the 1950s weren't the same kind of harmless glow pigments we have today, and they were not very good for everyday use. On top of that, the inks became very expensive to produce, difficult to print consistently, and they just didn't really age well. By the 60s, most of the companies that were doing this had abandoned the glowing finishes altogether. But the cool thing is that with our modern fancy computers we have now, we can easily bring back that glowing aesthetic digitally without using any hazardous material. We can just use things like gradients, blur effects, or maybe color overlays. So while we're not printing posters with radioactive ink anymore, you can still capture that glowy style of the Atomic Age in a digital format that is going to be way safer. So if you're looking to expand your skill set, maybe widen your portfolio, or maybe you just like retro or vintage design, Atomic Age is a great one to learn. And now you have the blueprint and ingredients to create it yourself. You could drop a planet icon and some rockets together, add a starburst, slap a hand-drawn headline or a font together, and suddenly you have got the makings of an Atomic Age poster. And one last thing, if you are ready to start experimenting with this style or any others, you can start doing it again in Kittl for free. You don't need a credit card or anything to start up. I just want you to give it a try. If you feel like Kittl is right for you after you go in and play around with the free plan for a little bit, and then you want access to more premium tools and fonts and things like that, I do have a promo code for you down in the description for a percentage off your pro or expert plan. But go get started for free. Just go check it out, check out our other tutorials, and see if you like it. All right, I need to go make sure that there is no radioactive ink on some of the posters I'm printing, so don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.